Ξεκινάμε λοιπόν με την πρώτη διάλεξη για αυτή τη χρονιά, του 2023 εννοώ, του 5ου κύκλου Σειράς Διαλέξεων του Μεταπτυχιακού Προγράμματος Σπουδών στη Διαχείριση και Προστασία Περιβάλλοντος, η οποία αυτή τη χρονιά αφιερώνεται στις γυναίκες περιβαλλοντικές επιστήμες. Κατά τη διάρκεια λοιπόν αυτού του έτους, είχαμε την ευκαιρία, την τιμή, να ακούσουμε διάφορες προσκεκλημένες, οι οποίες δουλεύουν εδώ και χρόνια σε περιβαλλοντικά θέματα, κυρίως σε θέματα που αφορούν την βιοποικιλότητα, την κλιματική αλλαγή, τη διαχείριση και των οικοσυστημάτων. Για σήμερα, λοιπόν, η προσκεκλημένη μας είναι η καθηγήτρια Helen Roy από το Κέντρο Οικολογίας και Υδρολογίας του Ηνωμένου Βασιλείου, η οποία θα μας μιλήσει για την εμπλοκή των πολιτών στην καταγραφή της άγριας πανίδας. Θα δώσω τώρα το λόγο πριν να το πω αυτό, να τονίσω γιατί είναι πάρα πολύ σημαντικό νομίζω, ότι η σειρά αυτή των διαλέξεων έχει τη στήριξη της Επιτρόπου Περιβάλλοντος της Κυπριακής Δημοκρατίας. Σταματώ λοιπόν εδώ και θα δώσω το λόγο στην κυρία Helen, η οποία θα προλογίσει την ομιλήτριά μας για απόψε. Ellie, over to you in order to give a short introduction of Professor Helen Roy. Thank you.
Thank you, Yannis. Good evening. We are very happy to have Professor Helen Roy with us. Helen Roy is an ecologist at the UK Centre of Ecology and Hydrology. Her research focuses on the effects of environmental change, particularly biological invasions, on biodiversity and ecosystems. She leads many collaborative national and international research projects on biological invasions, with a focus on enhancing information flow to inform understanding on the impacts of invasive alien species. She also enjoys science communication and public engagement with research, which led to her interest in citizen science, an approach that she has implemented in a number of contexts. Professor Roy is currently leading a global assessment on invasive non-native species for the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Helen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much to you both, and thank you very much for inviting me to be with you all. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
And you can see my slides, because I can't see anything other than my slides. Perfect, that's great. Let me know if they don't change, but it's really wonderful to be with you all, and I wish I was there in person. That would be really fantastic, but it's great to be with you remotely nevertheless. And thank you for that very kind introduction as well, Ellie. That's wonderful. So I'm going to talk this afternoon about engaging people in recording wildlife, and it's going to be a bit of a whirlwind with lots of information, but I'd be really happy to take questions either at the end of my presentation, or indeed if people want to be in contact with me after this, they're very welcome to do so. So thinking about citizen science, there's been a lot of discussions around the different types of citizen science. And I think that when we think about biological recording, it's an activity that's gone on for a very, very long time, hundreds and hundreds of years, before the term citizen science was coined. But nevertheless, citizen science has been a useful term to embrace the activities that involve volunteers in science. And this picture here is from a paper by Michael Pocock, who I work with at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and he was dividing out different approaches to citizen science, whether they were contributory, collaborative or co-created, or indeed individual research projects or biological recording, and looking at the way in which different people are involved at different stages of the project, from the design stage at the very beginning through to the production of outputs towards the end. And you can see these different icons representing different people. And one of the things that he really highlights here within this figure is that there are volunteers, some of who do not have expertise in that particular science area, and some who are expert volunteers. And these expert volunteers are particularly important within the process of biological recording within the UK, and they play a really pivotal role in gathering the people together and communicating more widely with the biological recorders within their particular taxonomic group, but also in terms of the quality assurance and reviewing records as they come through. A number of years ago, Michael and I undertook a project where we reviewed hundreds and hundreds of citizen science projects from all around the world to see whether or not there was an obvious way in which citizen science projects cluster, and particularly thinking about these ways in which we might describe citizen science. But actually, when we looked across sort of attributes of all of these hundreds and hundreds of projects, and we put it into a multivariate analysis, essentially they just scatter across the axes. And I think actually that is really wonderful, because it shows that diversity of citizen science, that huge diversity. We can see a kind of some draw out along those axes the way in which those projects are distributed, and we can see that some take a very simple approach, some are much more elaborate, for example hypothesis-led citizen science, where there's much more involvement within the project, and there's also some that are mass participation and some that are much more smaller scale, involving a few people perhaps in scientific sampling. But from this graphic that may well be making you all feel a little dizzy by now with it going round and round, what we can see is that there has been a move over time towards that mass participation approach. And this seems to have been really driven by emerging technologies, by things such as smartphone apps and online recording. So there is some pattern in terms of development over time in citizen science, and these emerging technologies are continuing to drive and to revolutionize citizen science. And I was recently involved in this paper, Emerging Technologies Revolutionizing Insect Ecology and Monitoring, which maybe you'd be interested to take a look at, that highlights the range of technologies which are being involved specifically with insect citizen science. I just thought I'd mention another project that Michael Pocock is leading, and that's a project called Decide. And I won't say very much about it, but you might want to take a look at it within the project websites of the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And essentially it is involving and directing citizen scientists towards specific places to do the biological recording, where those biological records could have the most effect in terms of enhancing the modelling. So really kind of a strategic approach to sampling by the volunteers. So citizen science is extremely diverse, and we can see, for example, citizen science such as conker tree science. Another project that I was involved in is called Bumblebee Discovery. We can also see these mass participation biological recording projects, and I've been based in the Biological Record Centre within the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology for about 15 years now, and I've been involved in the zoology side of things within the Biological Record Centre, which is a tremendous privilege to work with lots of volunteers involved in recording a whole variety of different groups. So this circle shows the range of biological recording schemes and societies that we have within the UK. And there's a focus here on atlases, because many of these citizen science national schemes aim to produce atlases. They aim to produce maps of the species that they are recording. And these atlases are beautiful and amazing achievements. They're also phenomenally useful in terms of marking a particular point in time for the data set and allowing us, particularly when there are repeat atlases, to be able to make comparisons over time, knowing that there's been some kind of structure to what is otherwise quite ad hoc gathering of occurrence information. But I think more the take-home message from this circle of schemes, if you like, is just that sheer range and diversity of recording that is happening within the UK. And I think it is really inspiring that there are many recording schemes around the world for some of the insect groups, and particularly those charismatic ones. But here in the UK, for some reason or other, we have this long history and this long legacy of biological recording, which has resulted in just this immense diversity of species that are recorded, from tiny little micromoths to soil invertebrates through to the more charismatic bumblebees and other species. So we're celebrating centuries of recording wildlife, and indeed the Biological Record Centre was established in the mid-1960s, so it's celebrating many, many decades of activity with the biological recording community. And although now we have smartphone apps and we have online recording, still that sort of basic activity in terms of recording species is very much the same as it's always been. It's very much about going to record a species where you see it, what it is that you see, when you see it, and who you are. And historically, people would have filled in recording cards and notebooks to do that. And more increasingly, they're using smartphone apps. So this is just to show the data, and this is an animation by my colleague Tom August, the data coming in on 1 year within the UK to a system called iRecord. So it's just one of the recording online systems. And I think what's incredible is that spatial coverage that we see just for 1 year. There are some gaps. We can still see some green aspects on that map, and particularly there are regions like the Scottish Highlands where there are gaps, but actually it's incredible coverage just from the volunteers being out and about and recording what they see. I'm an entomologist, so I'm particularly excited to see that blue line, the invertebrates being really high there. And maybe you're thinking that seems a little strange. What about the birds? Surely there's more birds recorded, or indeed the plants. And you would be right, but this is just for this system. A lot of insect data comes into the system, whereas many people record their bird sightings on another system called BirdTrack. So the Biological Record Centre, we have more than 105 national schemes and societies listed. Many of these are the recording schemes that are making those wildlife observations, that so-called sort of unstructured occurrence data. But there are a number of monitoring schemes which have a much more structured approach. For example, the butterfly monitoring scheme, where people walk transects and follow a very strict protocol in order to gather that biodiversity information. And then there's a number of other smaller study groups that would have a whole range of activities involved. What's very exciting is we're often having new schemes coming online and new people stepping forward and volunteering to compile information around a particular taxonomic group. And all of these volunteers that oversee these schemes are absolutely incredible. So lots of people involved and lots of activities. And on this graphic, we see, so we have tens and tens of thousands of volunteers involved in these schemes every year in the UK. There are people who may just record a sighting when they're out and about, perhaps walking their dog. And then all the way at the other end of the spectrum, if you like, are those who might be writing and editing books, writing papers, producing identification keys, doing more advanced analysis. There's something for everyone within the biological recording community, for those who don't have a huge amount of time, to those who have more time or motivation or expertise to do more. And as I mentioned, atlases have been an extremely important part of the activity of the biological recording schemes and societies, but also producing trends for a whole variety of species is really important for a whole variety of reasons, not least because the government uses it to underpin to be the evidence to underpin their strategies and policies, for instance. So one of the ways in which we report to the government departments is through the UK biodiversity indicators. And I realise I'm going through these slides very quickly, and I'll happily go back to any at the end. But within the biodiversity indicators that are published within the UK on an annual basis, many of them are using this volunteer data. And this is just one showing a change in distribution of UK priority species over time. But we also contribute through these biological records to a report on an annual basis called the State of Nature. And it's a fantastic report involving a partnership of organisations and celebrating not only the biodiversity, but also the people who are providing the biodiversity information. So this slide is just to show that sort of data flow system and the way in which there might be a recorder on the ground, and we're seeing an increasing number of recorders over time, and they might be providing their data into iRecord or indeed into another online system, and they may be doing that through an app or on their computer. And then it flows to the national recording schemes and societies who verify that information that's coming in. They check every line, they check all the records, and provide feedback to the recorders on the accuracy of their citing. And then we have a network of local record centres called a LERC, where some of that information might flow. And we also ultimately provide the data to the National Biodiversity Network Atlas, where the information is then shared through to GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. So one other paper that I've recently been involved in is looking at community science or citizen science within entomology with Mary Gardner from the US. And one aspect that we looked at in particular was just to focus on pollinators and to think about the diversity of pollinator initiatives globally. And for me, very excitingly, you'll see Pomsky featured right in the center in the pink letters. I hope you can see that underneath the structured observations. And in the UK, we developed this pollinator monitoring scheme, which we did a lot of work in terms of developing it and designing it and working with volunteers to think about the ways in which we could go about gathering pollinator data sets, particularly to inform the national pollinator strategy for bees and other pollinators in England. And it's been really exciting for me to work with Kelly and Sophie and Kula at the Environment Centre in Akrotiri, but also with Ellie and Andri and Joanna and Yakovos and many others who's I'm going to be terrible at not mentioning, that we've been working on Pomsky, implementing the pollinator monitoring scheme for Cyprus, and that's been so exciting and so rewarding, and I value my collaborations with people over in Cyprus enormously. It's an absolute pleasure. So the UK pollinator monitoring scheme in the UK has been tremendously successful in terms of engaging people in recording pollinators. Some people provide pollinator information through what's called flower insect time counts. I'm going to come back to that in a little while. And others complete quite a lot of sort of structured surveys, including pan-trap samples within specific squares, which you can see distributed on that map, and they're sort of stratified in their distribution to allow us to be able to produce trends at a regional level across the UK. And we use this information alongside the records that come in through the Bees, Wasps and Ants Recording Society and also the Hoverfly Recording Scheme to look at long-term patterns and trends. And just like we hear in so many cases and in the media, there is a decline in pollinating insects in Britain, just as we're hearing in other places around the world as well. But when it comes to developing POMs, I think that's a really important part of engaging people in biological recording. We gave a lot of thought to the way in which we went about it. How long would we need to leave the pan traps out? How many pan traps would we need? How many squares would we need to be able to derive data that would allow us to come up with robust trends over time in species richness? And we published a paper on how we went about that in terms of those different survey methods for monitoring insect pollinators and flower visitation. And it's been wonderful to see the data coming in since we launched the pollinator monitoring scheme, and we provide feedback and newsletters to the recording community, and that's a really important part of this. And you can see on these diagrams, you can visit our pollinator monitoring scheme website and go into more detail. Within those, you can click on various host flowers and see what the visitors have been, and we hope that that's engaging for the volunteers and allows them to think about where their data is appearing within these data sets. So this pollinator monitoring scheme, it's all about partnerships and it's all about the people. And there's a lot of people and partnerships involved within this, from our funding bodies across the government agencies, but also our collaborators through NGOs such as Butterfly Conservation, Bumblebee Conservation Trust, the British Trust for Ornithology, the Natural History Museum, Hymettus, but also our academic partners as well at the University of Reading and the University of Leeds. And I imagine that you might recognize the picture at the bottom where we were carrying out some flower insect hind counts within Akrotiri, and you can see Joanna there, who's been instrumental in developing Pomsky and encouraging people to get involved. I thought that having had sort of 20 minutes describing to you more broadly about sort of biological recording and citizen science within the UK, that I would now make some focus towards ladybirds. And I'm passionate about ladybirds. I'm an entomologist. I find all insects absolutely amazing. But I have a particular fondness for ladybirds. And I've been really fortunate as a volunteer to be one of the scheme organisers that I mentioned. And I lead the UK Ladybird Survey alongside Peter Brown, who's at Anglia Ruskin University. And I just thought I would talk through some of the ways in which we've been engaging people in recording ladybirds and some of the ways in which we then use that information that comes through. So we have a website, the Ladybird Survey website, and we were one of the first, I think it might have even been the first wildlife survey to be online and have online recording, certainly in the UK. And we launched the survey when the Harlequin ladybird arrives online. So the survey online, because there had been a ladybird recording scheme since the early 1970s, the Coccinellity recording scheme. But when the Harlequin ladybird arrived, and it was first recorded in the UK in 2004, this is an invasive alien ladybird native to Asia, introduced in many places around the world as a biological control agent of pest aphids. But it spread to the UK, not intentionally introduced here, but it got here and was first recorded in 2004. We knew that there was nothing that we could do about it after it had arrived, but we saw an opportunity to use it as a way to promote ladybird recording more generally and to increase participation in recording of ladybirds. And that animation that you just saw, again produced by Tom August, shows the spread of the Harlequin ladybird within the UK. It spread at about 80 to 100 kilometres per year after first arriving. It doesn't only feed on aphids, it will also feed on a whole variety of other insects, and so therefore there's concern that it poses a threat to biodiversity. So we set up an online recording site for all ladybirds and gave a focus towards the Harlequin ladybird, encouraging people to talk about and record Harlequin ladybirds. And then we, over the years, have done a huge amount to promote the scheme and to engage people in recording of ladybirds. So we've done a lot of media activity, children's television, newspaper activity, the Times at the bottom there, where you see the ladybirds all over the front page of the Times. That particular year, a journalist asked to come out on field work with Peter and I, and to just see what it was like to be out recording ladybirds. You can see on the top there, there's an exhibition that we put together for the Royal Society, Summer of Science. That was back in 2009. And those ladybirds that you can see sort of stuck to the display, I still use today for public outreach events and engagement. But I think there were about 8,000 people visited that exhibition, which was included a lot of other science projects as well. But basically, we've done a lot of talking about ladybirds, and that's been hugely enjoyable. We've done a lot of events as well, events at schools, events in agricultural shows, science festivals, and one of the things that, of course, through the pandemic, when we weren't able to do in-person events and that public engagement in that way, suddenly there became a variety of opportunities to do virtual events and podcasts such as the Into the Wild podcast, but also things like virtual meetups through the Field Study Council. So we just take any opportunity we can to promote the recording of ladybirds and to help people celebrate them. We also provide lots of ways to contribute records. So we still get some letters through the post. So I get a letter every year, just at the beginning in about January, and I just received it when I went back to work after Christmas from a woman who records the ladybirds that appear behind a thermometer in her hallway. And it's lovely to hear from her every year. And she just tells me how many ladybirds appear to spend the winter time in her hallway. And that's a fantastic biological record. It's now a long-term data set as well. But of course, we have a smartphone app. We have the iRecord online recording form. Some people send in spreadsheets. Sometimes people send in an email. The most common way for sure is through the smartphone app or through the website. We've also produced a lot of resources over the years, and I think that's really important too, having information that people can use to help guide them in their recording. And most recently, we produced a field guide for ladybirds of Britain and Ireland, which is illustrated beautifully by Richard Lewington and includes all of the ladybird species in Britain. I say that and think, of course, you wouldn't be surprised, it includes all of the ladybirds. But about 20 species in Britain are really tiny and don't look like ladybirds at all. They're little brown insects or black insects, slightly hairy. They might have a pattern. And this book is the first book that has all of those species included alongside those that we think of being ladybird-like, the more charismatic, brightly coloured ladybirds. I also really love these fold-out charts that the Field Study Council produce, and Kelly Martineau from the JSHU and I have worked quite a lot with the Field Study Council to produce other resources for raising awareness around the importance of insects, for instance. It's really important to provide feedback as well when engaging people, and it's there's many things about being a recording scheme organizer that I love, but I do really enjoy that interaction with people. And I just include this example. It's a lot of information here, but basically it just gives the example whereby on Twitter, this person, Pierre had posted a picture of a ladybird, and they were saying, could this be a hieroglyphic ladybird? For me, a hieroglyphic ladybird is really exciting because we just don't see them very often. And so I said it's quite tricky to do this on a photo, and it could also be another species, for instance. But I got then Richard Comont, who is another ladybird recorder, and said, what do you think, Richard? He said, well, I would need to see the prosternum. And at that point in our Twitter thread, the person didn't have the photo. But then I also thought, well, this is in your back garden. And actually, this is a heathland specialist. So I'm thinking this is increasingly unlikely to be the hieroglyphic ladybird. Anyway, he went out, the recorder went out into the garden, Per went out, he refound it and he brought it back in. He took a photo of the prosternum. Richard said, fantastic, it is indeed a hieroglyphic ladybird. Meanwhile, another recorder got into the conversation, was saying, what a great debate, best use of Twitter, and I couldn't agree more. And there it was, a hieroglyphic ladybird in their back garden. And that kind of feedback and that enjoyment of us kind of unraveling what that was really highlights to me part of the joy of biological recording. When we look at over time in terms of the numbers of records received for ladybirds, we can see a huge leap in the early 2000s after the Harlequin ladybird arrived. And that's when we went online and when the mass participation really, really took off. But I have to say, when I think of all the people who ran the survey before Peter and I, we really stand on their shoulders, because they were running it in a time when there wasn't online recording, there wasn't the social media and the ability to reach out to so many people in such a very easy way. Yet they were the people who started the Ladybird recording scheme and managed to get those historic records in. And I just thought I'd show you some of the information that we get through from the recording scheme. And this is some fairly recent data where we see the sort of number of records over time. And I've just produced it for 3 species here: the Harlequin ladybird, Harmonia axipridis, the 7-spot Coccinella septempunctata, and then Adelia bipunctata, the little 2-spot ladybird. And these are sort of visualizations that we're now producing very easily, and that recorders can also take a look and dip into the data in more detail. But basically, you can see we get an awful lot of records for all of these different species over time, and particularly the Harlequin ladybird and the 7-spot are very commonly recorded species. It's really important to us to share the data openly, and we publish through the National Biodiversity Atlas, but also we published a data paper on the Harlequin ladybird dataset in particular, because we felt that it was an amazing biological invasion dataset that could have a lot of value for many, many other people. And so we wanted to document it really clearly and really well for people to be able to make the most of it. And from all this data that's been gathered, we're able to produce some trends and to be able to look at what's the status of these species over time. And again, a kind of depressing picture of decline for quite a number of species, including, for example, Adelia bipunctata, this very charismatic a ladybird that in the UK in my childhood was very, very common and widespread and has been really showing quite a decline. And then at the other end, we can also see Coccinella hieroglyphica, also a species that's struggling, but great to then see it in that person's garden. Some species are on the increase, perhaps not surprisingly, the Harlequin ladybird, because it's a new arrival and it's just expanding its range across the whole UK. But also another few new arrivals. These are these tiny ladybirds that don't really look that ladybird-like, the Rhizobia species. There are new arrivals in the UK. The orange ladybird, Halesia, there on the left, is a species that we thought of as being associated with ancient woodlands. And it's gone under a massive range expansion and seems to be adapting to feed on a whole variety of different mildews. So yeah, lots to find out with that one, and we're not really sure why, but it's great to see it increasing its range. So another aspect that we've been able to look at is using these amazing data sets is can we see any correlation with the arrival of the Harlequin ladybird and the distribution patterns of some of the native ladybirds? And we had enough really good data for 8 native species of ladybird in Britain and the same species in Belgium. So the red lines are data from Belgium and the black lines are data from the UK. And I won't go through all of those in any detail, but what essentially the take-home message is 7 out of 8 of those species in the UK are showing distribution declines, and those declines are strongly correlated with the arrival of the Harlequin ladybird. So just for example, that far corner where I've put the little 2-spot ladybird picture, the 2-spot ladybird was increasing in its distribution in the UK. That's the solid black line, and it's over time along the x-axis. And then the arrival of the Harlequin, which is the dashed black line, is where Harlequins are present, and we saw a 44% decline in distribution. So this is strong evidence that the Harlequin ladybird, through predation and competition, is leading to a decline of native ladybirds. We've also done an awful lot of laboratory studies and field experiments to show that there are these mechanisms at play of predation and competition. So essentially the Harlequin ladybird is eating these other ladybirds, and also for those that are aphid feeders, it is out competing them as well. What we don't know is what effect that will have on the functioning of the ecosystem and the resilience of the ecosystem. So clearly these are important, many of them are important pest controllers. Will that pest control function be the same with these assemblages dominated by harlequin ladybirds, or will there be changes in that function? I just thought then I'd mention another aspect of the sort of engaging people part and this wonderful ladybird community that we have all around the world. And Audrey Grez and Tanya Zavizo, who are pictured in this photo, have a ladybird recording scheme. They lead it in Chile, and they invited Pete and I over there to talk about our different recording schemes, to meet the scientists within their groups, and also to do some field work with them. So one of the things we did, we went up into the Andes to see how high the harlequin ladybirds were occurring, and we got the highest record at that time, 3,578 meters above sea level. So the harlequin ladybirds are in this landscape. It's unbelievable, and they're feeding on little tiny insects in amongst those sort of green patches that you can see there. And then more recently, Victoria Verenkraut has been leading a ladybird survey in Argentina, and she came and visited us in the UK, and we talked a lot about approaches to this, and she's been just tremendously successful in gathering ladybird records and tracking the spread of the harlequin ladybird through Argentina. We get many records, and it does take quite a lot of time to go through them. We've often got a backlog. We're often a little bit behind. So one of the things we've been thinking about is, can we use image analysis to be able to help us in terms of verifying some of the records that we're receiving? And so this is a paper which I worked on with Terry and also Tom August, and essentially there's great promise for using computer vision for helping us with verification, but we're not quite there yet. But it certainly could be a way to filter out some of the records where we have other attributes, other metadata that allows us to have certainty around them. So one of the things as well that we've been thinking about is, how can we use citizen science more broadly for monitoring biological invasions? And we saw the success with encouraging people to record harlequin ladybirds, and we still get this amazing data sets for the harlequin ladybirds. And I think also it's given the UK government confidence that citizen science is a valuable way to gather information and to gather records. And following some horizon scanning work that we did within Britain, and noting that Vespa velutina, the Asian hornet, was a high-risk species arriving in the UK, we set up this citizen science project for monitoring the Asian hornet. And I won't go into a lot of detail, but you can see on that graph we get a huge number of potential sightings of the Asian hornet every year, and we did raising awareness and television work and writing articles, but also celebrating the beauty of hornets. I will say that as well. It wasn't all about the threat they pose. But as a consequence of this information, though we get thousands of potential sightings, we only have a couple of confirmed sightings every year in the UK. And so far, year on year, since 2016, we've been able to eradicate Asian hornets. So then one thing that we were asked to do was, by DEFRA, to look at where would Asian hornets be had that eradication not taken place. And from the coupling of environmental suitability models with spread models, we can see on that map that with that orange, the little circles are the nests that have been removed. We can see that there would have been a lot of spread from those few sightings. So we've written a lot about alien species in citizen science, and Kelly and Ellie and I and many others have worked through a project called Alien CSI, which is sadly now just coming to an end, but it's been a huge amount of fun and incredibly productive. And you can find out lots of information. The website will stay alive, the Alien CSI website, and there's lots of information on that about citizen science and alien species. I've already mentioned that paper. One other paper that we produced through the Citizen Science Alien CSI is thinking about, can we use citizen science to look at species interactions, we talk about that within this paper within ecography, and I think there's huge potential for doing more around interactions and citizen science. And it's lovely to see a mosquito as a focal point there, this was a collaboration with Kelly involved as well, and thinking about the interactions with citizen science, and in this case a case study around mosquitoes. So just to summarize, and it's been a lot of information, but there are many, many reasons for engaging people with biodiversity monitoring. And I think particularly now that we're thinking post COP15 and the global biodiversity framework and the new targets that have been set, actually one of the really exciting things from that and encouraging things, and something to give us hope in terms of biodiversity, is that there will be a biodiversity monitoring framework alongside that to try and increase the biodiversity data holdings all around the world. And that's incredibly exciting. And I think engaging people with biodiversity is going to be such an important part of that. But although we need this data to address big ecological questions, and we need to engage people in decision making, particularly around conservation and biodiversity decision making, I think that actually just celebrating biodiversity together is inspiring and such an utter joy. And so for me, that is also a big reason to engage people with biodiversity. So thank you very much for inviting me to be part of your seminar series, and thank you to all of the funders and to my amazing collaborators, but particular thanks to all the volunteers who provide their data so generously and are just an absolute pleasure to work with. And thank you all very much for listening.
Helen, thank you so much for this talk. It was really inspiring. As